Most people believe the sky is where the secrets are. That's what we were taught to believe, too. Lights in the atmosphere, objects crossing radar lines, shapes moving faster than anything we could build. But the first thing I ever helped recover didn't fall from the sky. It came from the bottom of the ocean. And the truth is, that mission never officially happened. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former serviceman, United States Air Force. I wore the uniform long enough to understand something most civilians never have to face. Silence is not always loyalty. Sometimes it's containment. For decades, I stayed quiet. Not because I forgot what I saw, because I understood what would happen if I spoke. You don't stumble into operations like the one I'm about to describe. They don't show up in briefings. They don't exist in normal command structures. You are moved into them quietly, almost invisibly, like a piece sliding across a board you didn't know you were standing on. That's how it started for me. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't intelligence. I followed orders. That was my job. Transport, logistics, field support, the kind of work that keeps operations running while other people write the reports. The kind of role where you see things, but nobody expects you to interpret them. And that's exactly why men like me were useful. The call came in the late 1980s. I won't pretend I remember the exact day. When you live inside the military long enough, dates blur together. What stays clear are moments, small details that shouldn't matter but somehow never leave your mind. The smell of jet fuel, a hangar that had been cleared too quickly, 3 men in civilian suits who never introduced themselves. We were told the operation belonged to a joint recovery task group, temporary assignment, short duration, minimal briefing. That alone was unusual. Normally, even classified missions come with some kind of operational context, a vague threat, a training objective, something. This time there was none, just coordinates, North Atlantic, international waters, and a single sentence repeated twice during the briefing. You will retrieve material. Not wreckage, not equipment, material. At the time, I didn't think much about that choice of word, but I would later. The aircraft that took us out wasn't marked the way standard Air Force transports usually are. The insignias were stripped down, the tail numbers partially obscured. Inside the cabin were containers already bolted to the floor, reinforced crates with shock suspension systems built into their frames. I had never seen containers like that before, not for aircraft cargo, not for standard military transport. They looked more like something designed to hold instability. The flight itself was quiet. Nobody talked much. Even among servicemen, there are moments where conversation dies because everyone senses something unusual. That was one of those flights. We landed on a naval support vessel already waiting at the coordinates. And that's when the first strange thing happened. The ship's crew wasn't Navy, at least not officially. No visible rank patches, no ship insignia. Just dark uniforms and men who moved with the quiet discipline of people used to operating without paperwork. One of them met us on deck. He didn't salute. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "You're here to lift what comes up." That was the entire explanation. I remember looking out across the water that night, completely calm. No storms, no wreckage, no debris field. Just open ocean under a sky that felt heavier than it should have. The recovery platform was already in position. A deep water retrieval rig lowered far below the surface. Something had been located days earlier, we were told. Something metallic. Something not listed in any shipping records. Something that didn't match the shape of known aircraft or submarines. At the time, we assumed it was foreign technology, maybe Soviet, maybe experimental. That would have been the logical answer. But logic doesn't last very long when you start pulling things out of water that's 2 miles deep. The lift began just after midnight, winches turning slowly, steel cables groaning under pressure. Nobody spoke while the platform rose through the water column. It took nearly 40 minutes before the first shape broke the surface. And even now, after all these years, I still remember the way the deck lights reflected off it. Not like metal. Metal throws light back sharply. This surface absorbed it. Smooth, curved. No rivets, no seams, no visible panels. Just a dark structure emerging from the ocean like it had been waiting there for centuries. Someone next to me whispered something under his breath. I never caught the exact words, but I remember the tone. Not excitement, not fear. Recognition. Because in that moment, every man standing on that deck realized the same thing at the same time. Whatever we had just pulled out of the Atlantic was never built by anything that flies under a flag. And that was only the first piece we recovered. The second one was worse. And the part nobody ever wrote into the official report was what we found inside. But before I explain that, there's something you need to understand about how silence works inside the military. Because what happened on that ship didn't stay on that ship. Not really. It followed some of us home. And the strange thing about buried things is, sometimes they don't stay buried. Sometimes they wait, just long enough for someone like me to start talking. So let me ask you something. If the ocean floor has been hiding technology we can't explain for longer than we've been flying aircraft, who exactly put it there in the first place? There's a moment during any recovery operation when the machinery stops sounding like machinery. You hear the strain in the cables. You feel the weight of whatever is coming up through the water. But this time the tension on the deck wasn't just mechanical. It was human. Every man standing there knew we were watching something that didn't belong in the category our training prepared us for. I had spent years around aircraft components, radar housings, composite structures, engine casings. Military hardware leaves fingerprints everywhere. Fasteners, welds, serial plates, stress marks. This thing had none of that. The first piece they lifted onto the deck was roughly the size of a small car, but the shape refused to settle into anything familiar. Not a wing, not a fuselage section, not even a pressure hull. It looked continuous, as if it had been grown instead of built. The surface was perfectly smooth, but not polished. It had a dull, almost organic texture, like the skin of something that had been in the ocean long enough to forget what sunlight looked like. I remember one of the technicians touching it with the back of his knuckles, not to test it, just to prove to himself it was real. The metal, if it even was metal, was cold in a way that didn't match the temperature of the water it had come from. Cold like something that held its own temperature. The suits, the men in civilian clothes, were already moving before the crane even set the piece down. They carried instruments none of us recognized. Not standard Navy equipment, not Air Force gear. One of them waved us back a few feet. No explanation, just a gesture. That was when I started understanding that this operation didn't belong to the branch of service printed on my uniform. We were labor, witnesses by accident, nothing more. The recovery rig went down again. The second lift took longer, nearly an hour this time. When the structure broke the surface again, it came up at an angle, water pouring off it in long silver sheets under the floodlights. This piece was larger, much larger, and this time there was no doubt it had once been part of something complete. The curvature was unmistakable now, not like aircraft curvature, more like the outer shell of something designed to move through a medium without friction, air or water, or something else entirely. One of the crew whispered the word submersible. Another man shook his head immediately. No propellers, no intake ports, no control surfaces. Just a seamless arc of dark material with a faint pattern beneath the surface, lines that looked almost like veins running through stone. I didn't notice the opening at first, None of us did. It was only when the crane rotated the piece slightly that the shape revealed itself. A break in the structure, not jagged like wreckage, but clean, almost surgical, like something had cut its way out. The suits got tense when they saw it, really tense. Orders started coming faster after that. Clear the deck, bring containment units, thermal shielding. Those were the exact words. I remember them because they sounded wrong together. Thermal shielding for something that had been sitting 2 miles below the surface. But what caught my attention wasn't the orders, it was the smell. When they moved the piece closer to the floodlights, something drifted out of that opening. Not rot, not salt water. Something sterile, like a room that had been sealed for a very long time. A few of the technicians leaned in with handheld scanners. The instruments clicked and whined softly, giving readings we couldn't see. One of the civilian men swore quietly. That's the first time I heard real emotion from them. Not fear, concern. The kind of concern you hear when a procedure has gone off script. That's when they told 2 of us, including me, to help stabilize the structure while they prepared the interior inspection. Just hold the braces, don't touch anything else. Simple instructions, the kind you don't question. So I stepped closer than most of the men on that deck ever did, close enough to see inside the opening. At first it looked empty, just darkness inside a curved chamber. Then one of the technicians angled a light into the interior, and the beam hit something that reflected back. Not metal, not glass, something pale. For a second my brain tried to translate it into something familiar, a piece of equipment, a damaged panel, a storage container. But the longer the light stayed there, the less convincing those explanations became, because shapes inside that chamber began to separate from the shadows. Contours, proportions, structure. And every instinct I had from a lifetime around aircraft wreckage told me the same thing. This wasn't cargo, this wasn't equipment, and it definitely wasn't machinery. One of the civilians stepped between us in the opening almost immediately, too quickly, like he had seen enough already. "Step back," he said. No rank, no explanation, just that same controlled tone. The light snapped off, the interior disappeared back into darkness. But by then it didn't matter, because I had already seen the outline. And once you recognize something like that, your mind doesn't let it go. They sealed the structure within minutes after that, heavy containment panels sliding over the opening, instruments humming quietly while readings were taken. Nobody explained what the scanners detected. Nobody told us what had been inside. But the behavior of the men running the operation had already answered the real question. This recovery wasn't about discovering something. It was about retrieving something they already knew existed, something that had been sitting on the ocean floor long enough to become a problem. And as we secured the containment crate, one thought kept circling in the back of my mind. Not fear, not excitement, just a simple question I couldn't shake. If this thing had been down there for decades, maybe longer, how many more were still waiting in the dark? Because the ocean is a very large place, and that night on the Atlantic, we only pulled up one object. But according to the manifests I saw later, that recovery operation didn't stop with us, not even close. And the strangest part, the piece we brought up that night wasn't the oldest one they had on record, not even by a long shot. Which raises a question the government never seems eager to answer. If we've been retrieving these things from the ocean for years, why does every public conversation still start with the sky? People imagine secrets as locked files, safes, vaults, classified folders stamped with warnings. But the real secret isn't the document. It's the understanding that some things are never meant to become documents in the first place. What happened after that object came out of the water is a good example of that, because once the structure was sealed inside the containment frame, the entire atmosphere on that ship changed. Up until then, the operation had felt like a recovery. After that moment, it felt like damage control. The civilian team took full control of the deck. Orders stopped coming from anyone wearing a uniform. Navy crew, Air Force personnel, technicians. We were suddenly just extra bodies standing in the wrong place. And when that happens in the military, you learn something quickly. The fewer questions you ask, the longer you stay useful. So we watched, quietly. The containment crate wasn't just a box. It had layers, insulated panels, shock absorbers, internal locking braces. When they slid the recovered structure inside, a low humming sound started immediately. Not loud, but steady, like a machine maintaining equilibrium. One of the instruments on the side began displaying readings. None of the units were labeled in any way I recognized. No radiation symbols, no temperature markings, just shifting numbers. The man monitoring it looked uneasy. That stuck with me. These were people clearly used to handling strange things. You could see it in the way they moved, the way they spoke to each other without wasting words. But something about the readings coming off that crate made them tense. And then one of them said something that still echoes in my head. The field hasn't collapsed. Field. Not heat, not pressure. A field. Another man asked how stable it was. The answer came back quiet. Stable enough for transport. Those words told me more than any official briefing ever could. Because if something has a field that can collapse, it means somebody already knows what happens when it does. Within an hour, the crate was secured inside the ship's cargo hold. The deck crew washed the entire recovery area with chemical spray, not seawater. A foaming compound that smelled sharp enough to burn your eyes. Standard contamination procedure, except nobody told us what the contamination was. That was the pattern of the whole operation. Action without explanation, procedure without context. We stayed on that vessel another 12 hours while paperwork, if you can call it that, moved through whatever channels controlled the mission. I didn't see any forms. I didn't sign anything, which in retrospect was probably intentional. The less that exists on paper, the less anyone can prove later. Before sunrise the next morning, a cargo aircraft arrived. Not a model I recognized, no visible markings. The kind of aircraft that lands, loads, and disappears again before most people realize it was ever there. The crate went aboard under heavy supervision. 2 of the civilian personnel flew out with it. None of the uniformed servicemen did. That was another detail that stayed with me. Whatever facility that object was headed to, it wasn't somewhere regular military personnel were meant to see. Our job had been simple. Lift it, contain it, hand it over, and forget it. That last part was never spoken out loud, but everyone understood it. On the flight back, the cabin was almost completely silent. No one discussed what we had seen. That silence wasn't forced, it was instinctive. Some experiences create their own quiet. But there was one moment I remember very clearly. A young technician sitting across from me finally broke the silence after nearly 2 hours in the air. He spoke so softly I almost missed it. You saw it too, right? He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. I looked at him for a long time before answering. Then I said the only thing that felt safe. I saw something. He nodded slowly, and neither of us said another word about it. When we landed, the operation dissolved almost immediately. Different vehicles, different departure points, no debriefing, no official acknowledgement, just a quiet separation of people who had briefly shared something they were never meant to share again. I went back to my normal assignment, same base, same work, same routine. For months, nothing happened, no follow-up, no questions, which, oddly enough, made the whole thing feel even more unreal. like a strange dream that had briefly intersected with real life. But about 6 months later, something arrived at the base that reminded me that night in the Atlantic had never really ended. It was a short briefing, small room, 5 people present, and one man who clearly didn't belong to our command structure. He looked around the room for a long moment before speaking. Then he said something that changed the way I understood that recovery forever. What you encountered was not an isolated incident, not an accident, not a one-time discovery, an incident, which meant there had been others. And then he said the part that stayed with me for the next 30 years. The ocean has always been the easier place to hide them. Nobody asked the obvious question. Nobody in that room was brave enough. But the thought formed in every one of our heads at the same time. If they had been hiding there, then someone, or something, had placed them there deliberately. And the truth is, that briefing didn't end with explanations. It ended with a warning, a simple one. You will not discuss the contents of this operation with anyone outside authorized channels. Standard language. I had heard it 100 times before. But this time the warning felt different, because it wasn't protecting a mission, it was protecting a reality. And the older I got, the more I realized something about that reality that still bothers me today. We didn't discover those objects on the ocean floor. We were retrieving them, which means someone, somewhere, already knew exactly where they were. And that raises a question that still keeps me awake some nights. If they knew where to find them, who told them where to look? There's a misconception people have about secrecy. They imagine threats, intimidation, men in dark suits warning you to keep quiet. That does happen sometimes. But most of the time, silence is maintained in a much simpler way. They let time do the work. People retire, memories fade, witnesses scatter across the country and start normal lives. And slowly, whatever happened becomes something no one talks about anymore. That's how the system protects itself. And for a long time, it worked on me. Years passed after that Atlantic recovery. I stayed in the Air Force for a while longer, finished my service, and eventually stepped back into civilian life like thousands of other veterans do. New job, new routines, the kind of life where the past becomes something you carry quietly but rarely explain. For a long time, I convinced myself the operation had been exactly what they implied, a rare recovery of something unusual. Maybe foreign technology, maybe an experimental craft. Strange, yes, but still human. That explanation lasted about 9 years, because 9 years after that night on the ocean, I saw something I was never meant to see again. It happened at a facility in the western United States. I won't name the location. Not because I'm protecting anyone, but because the place itself isn't the point. Places change, programs move. What matters is what was inside. At the time, I was working under a civilian logistics contract tied to defense infrastructure. The kind of job where you occasionally deliver equipment or documentation to installations that don't appear on ordinary maps. Nothing unusual about that in the defense world. What was unusual was the level of security surrounding one particular hangar. 3 checkpoints, 2 different badge systems, and inside the final access corridor, a set of doors thicker than any aircraft hangar door I had ever seen. The escort officer walking with me was polite but distant. He spoke very little. That's usually a sign the people inside already know more about you than you know about them. When we entered the hangar, the first thing I noticed was the lighting, dim, not dark but controlled. The kind of lighting you use when reflections matter. And then I saw it. Not the same object, but the same material. You never forget a surface like that. Smooth, matte, almost absorbing the light around it. The structure inside that hangar was partially disassembled, sections mounted on stabilization frames while technicians moved around it quietly. I stopped walking without realizing it, because in that moment I knew something with absolute certainty. The object sitting inside that facility had not come from the sky recently, and it had not been discovered by accident. I recognized the curvature, The same seamless architecture, the same absence of joints or visible fasteners. Even the faint vein-like patterns beneath the surface looked familiar. But this structure was intact, or at least more intact than the one we pulled from the Atlantic. The escort officer noticed I had stopped. He followed my line of sight toward the object. Then he said something that still echoes in my mind. "First time seeing one?" "Not this one, just one." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him something I hadn't planned to ask. "How many are there?" The officer didn't look at me when he responded. He kept his eyes on the structure, and he said something very carefully. "More than the public conversation is ready for." That answer told me everything, because by that point, nearly a decade had passed since the Atlantic recovery, which meant the object I was looking at had either been retrieved long before our mission or recovered after it. Either way, the conclusion was the same. The operation I participated in wasn't the beginning of anything. It was part of an ongoing process, a quiet collection effort, something that had been happening long enough to build procedures around it. Containment crates, specialized aircraft, facilities designed specifically to house things that didn't belong to any nation. That realization stayed with me for years after I left that hangar, and it slowly changed the way I looked at the world, because once you know that technology like that exists somewhere behind secured doors, you start noticing the strange gaps in the official story, the way certain questions never receive direct answers, the way discussions about unidentified craft always circle around the sky, while almost nobody talks about the oceans. But the oceans cover more than 70% of this planet, depths we still barely understand, pressure levels where human engineering struggles to survive. If someone wanted to hide technology on Earth for a very long time, there is no better place. No witnesses, no satellites, no easy access, just miles of water and darkness. And the uncomfortable truth is, we have only explored a fraction of it. I stayed silent about all of this for most of my life, partly because of the oath I took, partly because I knew how impossible it would sound, but mostly because I eventually realized something else. The government isn't hiding these recoveries because they're afraid of panic. They're hiding them because they don't fully understand what they've collected. And admitting that would change the balance of certainty people expect from institutions. So instead, the conversation stays small. Lights in the sky, radar anomalies, weather balloons, anything that keeps the public looking upward, while the real retrieval work continues far below the surface. And if what I saw in that hangar was only one example, then the question we should really be asking isn't whether these objects exist. The question is much harder than that. How long have they been arriving here? Because if some of them have been sitting on the ocean floor long enough to accumulate corrosion, long enough to become buried under layers of sediment, and whatever placed them there may have been visiting this planet long before any of us were born. And if that's true, then the silence I kept for 30 years wasn't protecting a secret. It was protecting a timeline, one that nobody in Washington seems willing to talk about. Which leaves us with a final thought I still can't shake. If we're only retrieving what we happen to find, how many more are still down there, waiting in the dark, exactly where someone left them?